Good afternoon, everybody. We will begin. My name is Sofia Gotti. I am the artistic organizer of the international exhibition Stranieri Ovunque, Foreigners Everywhere. And I'm delighted to be introducing today's panel of our meetings on art. Our discussion today is dedicated to popular art, a subject that links multiple themes within the exhibition and across the panels of the meetings on art. Connecting to yesterday's discussion, popular art intersects with indigenous practices. In fact, throughout the international exhibition, multiple of the artists designated as popular, self-taught, or outsider are also indigenous or mestizos, whose work represents indigenous worldviews and sometimes deals with colonial histories of violence and epistemicide. At the same time, the session today will bridge into tomorrow's panel, Modernisms, as many artists whose work is considered naive or folk are featured in the Nucleo Storico, the historical macro section of the exhibition that wants to trouble the perimeter of modernism everywhere. So in the papers presented today by thinkers and curators of international renown, we will see how certain terms that have accompanied the Western canon of art, for example, craft, folk, decorative, popular, vernacular, have served to exclude and sideline artists. Conversely, we will see how these same terms may instead serve to point out the limits of Western definitions of art and help us to understand those practices that do not sit neatly within any single definition. So beyond terminology, though, and theoretical formulations, this panel addresses the limits of culture and complicates the way we may engage with art. On a personal note, I remember encountering the work of each speaker on this panel as a graduate student over a decade ago, and I distinctly remember how through their eyes and through their words, I learned and began to see things differently, which up until that point had been completely different. So the first speaker I have the honor of introducing today is Lynn Cook, who is an art historian, a fellow Courtauldian, I will say, and a curator, currently senior curator in the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Lynn's research has broken ground into the often occulted histories of outsider artists in America and on textile art internationally. And her most recent exhibition, titled Woven Histories, Textiles and Modern Abstraction, will travel to the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa and to MoMA. Thank you very much. Lynn, please come up.
Thank you, Sophia, for that warm welcome. I'd like to begin by thanking Adriano and his team, Ilaria, Francesca, and others for the invitation and for making this travel so easy. My subject today is latecomers, and I'm going to talk about the way in which textiles in the US, or in relation to modernism in the US, have been absorbed or recognized at a relatively late date. I'm going to start just with one caveat. When I say American in this talk, I'm referring to the US, to what went on in American art histories of the 20th century into the 21st. Within this narrative, there are many terms. Popular arts is not one that's used widely in the 20th, 21st century in the US, but folk, vernacular, visionary, primitive, naive, and self-taught are. Some of those are terms that were current in the interwar period. Some we would not tend to use today. All of them, I think, are context-dependent. What they mean is defined by a situation geographically and historically, and most of them are accompanied by discovery narratives. That is, the work referred to under those terms is brought into the public space, the public discourse, through the intervention of museum curators, artists, often white male artists in the interwar years. So it's received into the mainstream art world under those specific categories and classifications. In the interwar years, as I said in the US, the preferred terms were probably self-taught. And by that it was meant an artist did not have accreditation through studying in an art academy. But of course, in anthropological terms, someone who is trained through craft practices within a community is not self-taught. So as I said, these terms are slippery and they mean different things at different times. In the United States, in the interwar years, that is, beginning just after the end of the First World War, the kind of work that was embraced and brought to public visibility was work that aligned with the primary art forms of modernism, that is, painting and sculpture. And it therefore didn't include things like furniture or jewelry or textiles or many of the art forms that are regularly referred to as applied art or the decorative arts. And two instances of this are works by Edward Hicks on the left, who was a Quaker minister and who painted a series of paintings called The Peaceful Kingdom. There are many, many of them, and they're a kind of allegory of the meetings of white settler culture and Native Americans. You see the treaty being signed in Pennsylvania in the left corner, and the biblical reference is to Isaiah, to that text which says, when the lion and the lamb lay down together, there is a peaceable kingdom. And the work on the right, Coriel's Ferry, is by an artist around whom very little is known, and the works he paints are landscapes of his local region in the Northeast, and they seem to have been done, if we can base it on the 3 or 4 examples, as a kind of hobby or a form of amateurism. The works that really circulated in or came to prominence tended to be more contemporary, and they were works that Alfred Barr, as director of the Museum of Modern Art, incorporated into the museum program on what he called an even playing field. What he was trying to do was to establish that works by formerly marginalized artists who lacked the kinds of formal accreditation, had a place within the modernist narrative. And I'm showing you 2 examples by African-American artists, Horace Pippin on the left, and William H. Johnson on the right. Johnson had formal academic training. What he's doing here, he lived in Europe for 20 or so years. He came back to the US on the outbreak of World War II and began to work in a primitivizing manner. And comparing 2 paintings, Pippin had no formal academic training, but taught himself and his work circulated in mainstream galleries. He won prizes. He had many solo shows. So despite these barriers of class and education and race, he managed to, his work was received at the time on a par with Johnson's. And both of them take as their subject the white abolitionist John Brown, who was hanged after an insurrection in favor of abolishing slavery. So a very popular subject in African-American canons in the late 30s. And the third example, an example of a work by a sculptor. This is the black African sculptor William H. Johnson, who was the first African-American to have a solo show at the Museum of Modern Art in 1935. He lived and worked in Nashville, and the work he made is a form of direct carving into stone without sketches or small models, which was the kind of work that vanguard sculptors were doing at the same time, and they therefore recognized his practice as essentially part of their own. It was not until the 1970s, really, that textiles first began to circulate in modernist circles. And the first textiles to do so are quilts. There are two important shows in the wake of the liberation movements of the 60s, the counterculture, the gay liberation, second wave feminism, and Black civil rights movement, when more experimental practices and a wider remit of the kind of work that could be looked at came to the fore. The first of these exhibitions is called Optical Quilts, and it was staged in 1965 at the Newark Museum, which is a general museum, not a museum of modern art. And it took examples from the collection of 18th and 19th century quilts, the makers unknown, but presumed to be white women, and put them on view as a kind of proto-modernist abstraction with optical, with a particular optical dazzle or an optical vibrancy that was the signifier of modernism. This show opened 2 weeks before the Museum of Modern Art's The Responsive Eye, which was the show that led to the coining of the phrase op art and the rise in the careers of Bridget Riley and Vasarely, for example. And it's not as if these are being incorporated into the realm of contemporary art. They're seen as something of precursors, and they would be the quilt would be taken up in a nativist discourse, because around this time the bicentenary of 1976 was in the offing, and quilts were seen as the preeminent folk art form in the US. They were seen as an American folk art form. It wasn't quite true. Their heritage lay in British and Scandinavian prototypes, but nonetheless the quilt was given this priority as folk art, and therefore as a kind of precursor to modernist abstraction. What you see here is a second exhibition, and this one, importantly, was at the Whitney Museum, and therefore in the very forefront of modern art at the time in New York. And this selection is a latest selection of quilts by a collector, Jeffrey Holstein, who's a friend of Barnett Newman and Roy Lichtenstein, who helped him edit the selection for presentation at the Whitney. And they're quite different quilts in that they're radically abstract, you could say. The motifs, the forms, the stripes, the patterns are much more abstract than in the previous examples, and these are pieced quilts. That is, they're made from strips of pre-existing cloth which are stitched together. They're not appliqued, and there are no motifs like flowers, and there are no narratives. And in this sense, the comparison could be more forcibly made with modernist abstraction, the kind of work of Frank Stella or Gene Davis or minimalist aligned painters. And the work could therefore be seen as painting adjacent. And I should just note, for this research, I'm particularly indebted to the work of Jenny Sorkin, who also was the scholar who found these two images. I want now to turn to the end of the century and what I see as the late coming, the arrival of textiles to center stage within a modernist or late modernist narrative. And the examples for this would be work by Jeans Bend quilters. The quilts that were shown in the two previous exhibitions were all assumed to be done by white women, though the actual quilt makers could not be identified. There was virtually no research, no historical writing on black quilt making in the 1970s. However, by the end of the century, this had changed dramatically, and it centered around this group of women quilt makers who lived in a small hamlet in Alabama called Jeans Bend, which was geographically remote. It was the poorest county in the United States in the 1930s during the Depression, so extremely poor, and part of a government WPA program to bring assistance into the community. And the women who started making quilts at this point continued making quilts with very little outside intervention through to the 1970s or 80s. So it's a single independent strand of quilt making that's intergenerational. What also sets these women apart is that they're sometimes working from worn work clothes like denims, from overalls and jeans, and sometimes from other kinds of domestic offcuts from sheets and towels and so forth. But they work in a strictly abstract idiom, and unlike the kinds of optical quilts that you saw before, which had very regular patterns and were highly symmetrical, what sets these quilts apart and makes them singular is that the patterns are constantly being interrupted with what is called structural variations. There's a very self-conscious process and practice of innovation, of refining a personal signature style within this, as these women made these quilts. And Mary Lee Bendorf, the person whose work you see here, is often regarded as the paramount quilt maker, and therefore they're working in a way that runs contrary to quilt making, which is essentially about preserving tradition and working within known patterns and idioms. So these remarkable quilts were first shown at the Fine Art Museum in Houston and came to the Whitney again in 2002, where they just became a sensation. They were greeted as not precursors of modernist abstraction in the US, but some of the greatest abstract art ever made in the US, a very different kind of reception. And at the same time, the work started to circulate. It was sent on a tour to some 15 cities across the country, and they were incorporated within the art world in terms that had no precedent, to the point where Mary Lee Bendorf was offered opportunities to make lithographs and other print series. And from having given up quilt making in the 90s when her health became poor, she started to make quilts again in light of this public recognition. And throughout this period of reception, you see her quilts again, and one by Annie Mae Young, another of women of her generation working at Jeans Bend. They were never making functional quilts. They were making these not to be used. By this stage, the economies were such that it was cheaper and easier to buy a blanket for the bed in winter, but they were making these self-consciously as aesthetic objects. And they were competing as kind of rivalrous relations with each other in the way that one would expect in an artistic community of artists who share many values and goals and strived to find original terms and solutions to a restricted set of formal problems. There's one more. And you can see how this kind of rhythm within the patterns in terms of the scale of the elements and the syncopation of the elements and the way the color relations form. This has also, of course, often been compared with jazz and the kinds of improvisation in a jazz rhythm. There was one other artist, black quilt maker, who came to the fore in these years, Rosie Lee Tompkins, whose history was different, but she too, like the other women I've mentioned, learned quilt making from her mother and grandmother, from women in her community. She did not make quilts continuously. It was only in the 70s, after a breakdown, that she took up quilt making, and she took it up not as, again, as a functional activity. She never fully quilted a quilt, in that she made only the pieced tops, and then and they were to be shown, they were to be looked at, they were not to turn into bedding. And her particular aesthetic, which you see here, often involves luxurious material which is purpose-built. So purpose-bought, much of her material she finds in textile markets and the like, and velvet is a very important material for her. And you don't see it in the slide, of course, but the images, as in velvet, are very sensuous, and they attract the light. So with this close tone palette of a range of dark greens, the optical effects and the sensuality is very pronounced. I'll show you a couple, another one. And you can see this language of great vibrancy and color contrast. And I'm putting it beside a painting by Mary Heilman to stress really the fact that at the moment that the quilts of Gee's Bend and Rosie Lee Tompkins are being accepted more or less without qualification, and the more or less depends on who's making that decision, is a moment in which painting is in what might be called an expanded form, where it's pushing at the conventions, whether it's of the rectilinear canvas or in terms of a planar form in a vertical orientation, or in terms of the materials used. So in this comparison between Nancy Shaver, who would be identified as a vanguard artist, and Tompkins, who now gained this recognition, the formal language of innovation is not so radically removed. And I want to end this talk by looking at the legacy, if you like, of the entry point of textiles into late modernist discourse in terms of US abstraction. And I'm going to turn now to first Mary Lou Schultz, who is Diné, Navajo weaver who learned to weave again through her mother or grandmother as a very young woman, and who in 1994 was commissioned to make a blanket using traditional techniques and materials, but with the motif of a computer chip. And this invitation or commission came from the Intel Corporation, which was a Silicon Valley tech company that was wanting to build a facility for assembling computer chips on the Navajo reservation, and with the support of Navajo elders. And they figured that a female workforce would be more tractable, they could pay lower wages, so they were hoping to attract women who were weavers within the Navajo community, and they hoped through commissioning this rug with the motif of the computer chip to make the point that the aesthetics of computer chips and traditional Navajo weaving were really very similar, and the nimble fingers of the weaver would be well suited to making computer chips. You may see this as a very cynical campaign, but for some time, indeed, there'd been a computer chip facility on Navajo land. Marilla Schultz was very interested in this commission, and she's replicated the chip with extraordinary detail. It's very, very skilled she's a very skilled weaving, and the component parts are exactly in place at the requisite scale. But of course, she's made all the decisions about color and therefore the consequences of color within the overall composition, and it's very much her work. She continued to work with computer chips, and you see an example here on the left from an unidentified chip from around 2006, because she found, or she argued, that the digital data produced by digital technology can be self-replicating and self-generating, and that eventually takes it outside white culture. It's not made by man or humans in that sense. It enters into another arena. And for her, that was something that was very stimulating, and she continues to work in this way from time to time, and usually on commission. These take a very long time to realize, as you can imagine. And you see the two examples of her work put in dialogue with a tapestry made on a customized jacquard loom by Annalise Aban, born in Argentina, living and working in Los Angeles, which also takes a computer chip as her point of departure. This is a historical chip that was very important in the history of image making, and she's made it in copper wire, which of course is material that computer chips would be used, and linen, and replicated it on a large scale with similar detail. And on the black smaller work is a painting by Jack Whitten. Here you see the Marilla Schultz in more detail. Here's a more recent example of Schultz's. And here's the Whitten. And this is based on an E-stamp, which is a precursor of what we think of as a QR code. It's a form of coding that encrypts image making or information, and it's part of the way this portrait is made to evoke Bobby Short, who's a famous black pianist. Jazz player at the Carlisle Hotel. But I've put these works together to indicate that I think there's an expanded sense of abstraction in recent years that comes out of an engagement with the digital, and that it comes from many sides, not just from within artists who are formally trained in academic art schools. There's the Schultz, the Saban in more detail. And I want to end by suggesting that work made more recently still in the last couple of years that in some ways or some instances builds on those histories takes a different turn. It's less about an expanded idea of painting in which textile can be material, technology, and subject matter, to a matter of identity, to questions of subject positions. And what you see here is work by Diedrich Brackens, who's a young queer-identified black artist trained in an art school for whom textile making was his preferred medium. And in this work, which is an early work, he's now working figuratively, but he started off using abstract geometric languages, which I think you can see very directly go back to both kente cloth, some of the most famous and most beautiful cloth made in Africa, and also to G's band languages, to the, particularly in the way perhaps the lime green components work within the overall form. In this moment, he's weaving on a very narrow strip loom in his studio, and he's stitching the strips together, and I think you can make that out. And that, too, is a reference to kente cloth, which is built up from narrow strips. And he leaves threads dangling within the field, so they're like paint drips or paint splatters, again, to build in this reference to painting histories. And finally, I'd pull out the text on the right-hand side, which comes not from those traditions, but I think from conceptual art traditions, and I think is a nod to the fact that as a male maker, he is entering a field which is generally coded or gendered as female, and again, it speaks to a queering of normative practices. And I would finish with this comparison with Ikshan Adams, who's a young weaver born in the coloured township outside Cape Town in South Africa, who identifies as Muslim and queer, and makes work that again looks to textile heritages as part of his, the construction of his identity, in this instance to Islamic rug weaving. And the point of this comparison in part is to say that these questions around textiles and identity, although I've pursued them in this talk as particular to the US, today far more broadly based. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for this really rich presentation. I am very happy to introduce next Ticio Escobar, who is a curator, professor, art critic, and essayist from Paraguay, and who has written over 15 books and received numerous international honors, including 5 honorary doctorates and awards for his defense of indigenous causes. I learned today that Ticio speaks 6 indigenous languages. He has also served as the director of culture of Asunción and the Minister for Culture of Paraguay, and he has co-founded the Museo del Barro, which is a groundbreaking institution in Asunción. It is my great honor to welcome you, Ticio. Please come up here.
Buenas tardes. Agradezco especialmente la invitación del curador de la Bienal de Venecia, Adriano Pedrosa, y todo su maravilloso equipo con quienes logré hacerme amigo estos días, aparte de quienes ya conocía anteriormente, como Sofía, que ya tenía una amistad con ella. Básicamente, quiero tratar algunas cuestiones que tienen que ver más bien con los encuadres teóricos del concepto de arte popular o cultura popular, vinculándolo con la figura del extranjero, que hace la cuestión fundamental de esta Bienal. Y extranjero el término extranjero, como yo identifico acá y en la Bienal en general, no se refiere tanto a quien ha nacido en otro país, que es la acepción común de la palabra extranjero, sino que está leído como una crítica a un sesgo colonialista que entiende al extranjero como el actual bárbaro, el excluido, el otro en cuanto amenazante y desde un sesgo de clase y raza, ¿no? Clasista y racista. Y así incluye muy genéricamente a los pueblos indígenas, a los trabajadores proletarizados, a los grupos marginalizados rurales y suburbanos, a los expatriados, exiliados, refugiados, y fundamentalmente incluye las subjetividades disidentes o diferentes basadas en diferencias de género y sexo, de religión y etnias, ¿no? Pero también este concepto que muy genérico, que en cierto sentido marca al otro diferente desde un lugar de cierta peligrosidad o de cierta reserva, tiene que ver también con muchos artistas y pensadores críticos, ya sea provenientes de las regiones periféricas o incluso dentro de la cultura eurooccidental, que tienen una posición crítica en relación a la cultura hegemónica y critican el logocentrismo colonialista euro-norteamericano desde dentro incluso de sus instituciones. En general, el pensamiento decolonial, en sentido muy amplio, encara esa crítica a un pensamiento hegemónico de privilegio basado en situaciones de posiciones de centro. Pero acá habría que hacer una salvedad de no entender centro-periferia de nuevo como una posición binarista, como una dicotomía absoluta, sino que hay una oscilación continua que tiene que ver con lugares diferentes, con el hecho de que los distintos poderes hegemónicos cruzan transversalmente los mapas y se asientan en distintos lugares con posiciones fluctuantes, de modo que la relación centro-periférica o artistas del centro y de la periferia es siempre una posición que admite terceros lugares y que tiene siempre un sesgo contingente y provisional. Desde ese punto de vista es importante entender lo popular o la cultura popular más bien como un adjetivo, lo popular, el arte popular, los sectores populares, las políticas populares, más que como un sustantivo que daría un carácter de nuevo como de bloque homogéneo a los sujetos considerados como populares. Entonces, lo popular no constituiría un bloque sustantivo, sino que marcaría distintas posiciones de sujeto, casi más bien un locus atravesado, usado por actores distintos que no constituyen una figura o un sujeto unificado, sino fragmentos, posiciones oscilantes, incluso a veces como muy diferentes entre sí y hasta adversarias, pero definidas por una posición común ante un centro excluyente, cuidando siempre de usar ese centro no como un sustantivo fijo y absoluto, sino más bien como una posición colonialista de exclusión y como un logocentrismo que se adjudica o se autoadjudica la hegemonía de la representación en clave cultural. Desde ese punto de vista, podemos entender el arte popular como las formas, las manifestaciones sensibles practicados por distintos sujetos y nosotros, a mí me interesa fundamentalmente referirme y yo trabajo a aquellos sectores populares que tienen que ver con tradiciones indígenas y con tradiciones rurales y suburbanas marginalizadas, sin negar en absoluto que ese término y ciertas condiciones compartidas también se apliquen a distintas situaciones de marginalización o contrahegemonía o posición de discusión con los cánones normativos, heteronormativos fundamentalmente del pensamiento logocéntrico, hegemónico. Desde ese punto de vista me interesa mucho discutir una concepción de la estética europea o por lo menos euro-norteamericana u occidental en sentido más amplio como única vía de acceso al arte, a las formas distintas de arte. Y pienso que distintas maneras de abordar el arte que se han visto definidas en las últimas décadas, que pasan por sistemas distintos de pensamiento, han enriquecido enormemente el pensamiento sobre el arte, viniendo tanto de la cultura popular, el pensamiento indígena, el pensamiento queer, feminista, negro, distintas formas de pensar e incluso la crítica de arte que pasa no tanto por la pura especulación teórica, sino que parte de los objetos y de las obras concretas que son en general olvidadas por un pensamiento de raíz idealista. Entonces, generalmente el arte popular de origen indígena en América Latina y en muchos otros, yo me circunscribo a lo que conozco yo, que es el pensamiento, las prácticas de América Latina, con raíces precoloniales por lo general, han atravesado o atraviesan continuamente situaciones de aculturación y de culturación, de vaciamiento cultural, por una parte, por la otra, de resistencia, por las cuales sobreviven muchas prácticas que tienen una larga tradición y se renuevan continuamente a partir de esos movimientos de resistencia y también los movimientos de transculturación, que son procesos continuos de intercambio por el cual las culturas, ambas culturas, salen quizá enriquecidos con nuevas formas y en ese sentido las culturas populares son capaces de enriquecerse con cualquier otra forma, aún las más innovadoras, toda vez que sean esas culturas las que gestionan el cambio y las que gestionan las incorporaciones, así como cualquier hecho impuesto desde afuera puede ser tremendamente nocivo y etnocida, en el sentido destructor de los procesos culturales, en la medida en que sea el propio sujeto popular, la propia comunidad, la propia etnia o el sujeto individual el que asume esos cambios desde sus propias posibilidades de percepción, de sensibilidad, de entendimiento y decisión y de deseo, entonces esas formas siempre podrán ser asumidas. ¿Qué pasa? Que en general el arte popular ha sido considerado como fuera del reino del arte occidental, fundamentalmente a partir del pensamiento duro de la estética, cuando Platón comienza a separar materia y forma, cuerpo, espíritu, forma, contenido, etc., está estableciendo en el pensamiento occidental una disyunción, una dicotomía que es difícilmente salvable, que es como la obsesión, la dificultad del pensamiento de Occidente de cómo saldar esa oposición entre sujeto, objeto, cuerpo, alma. Está continuamente sensibilidad e inteligencia, continuamente encontrándose con ese tajo que divide el pensamiento y la práctica, por lo tanto, en dos. Cuando Kant establece la estética como parte de la filosofía, intenta, como todos los filósofos modernos, saldar, unir esos mundos separados, pero en cierto sentido lo que hace es poner del lado de la forma vacía la posibilidad de que haya un principio de unión, y lo que hace ahí es establecer la autonomía de la forma o el esteticismo moderno, por la cual básicamente el arte es aquel ámbito en el cual la forma, la belleza sensible en este caso, es la que tiene no solamente hegemonía, sino preeminencia total. Entonces, todas aquellas obras afectadas a usos, a rituales mágicos, políticos, a usos prácticos, cotidianos, etcétera, que no estén regidos por la pura forma, entonces no pueden ser considerados obras de arte. Y ahí comienza la gran escisión entre arte y artesanía, entre las formas puras del arte, que son aquellas que no tienen ninguna utilidad aparentemente, porque de hecho, bien que la tienen política, económicamente, la obra de arte, aún las más puras, siempre tienen compromisos con el poder y con distintos sistemas económicos desde el capitalismo, cuando nace precisamente la gran división colonial. Entonces, el arte es considerado el arte puro, solamente las formas afectadas al propio goce o a la fruición estética, mientras que las producciones que tienen fines utilitarios, religiosos, chamánicos, etc., son considerados obras menores. A veces es utilizada la oposición arte-artesanía de modo ideológicamente muy tramposa, porque el arte se refiere a aquella operación a partir de la cual se trabajan la sensibilidad para incrementar el sentido del mundo. Se trabajan formas sensibles, imágenes, como para a través de ellos promover una comprensión más intensa del mundo, o sea, incrementar el sentido. Eso es. Por otra parte, la artesanía se refiere exclusivamente al hecho de manipular elementos básicos como para producir determinadas imágenes con técnicas básicas, etc. O sea, son ámbitos diferentes. Un artista, un pintor, un escultor es también un artesano. Trabaja con las manos determinados elementos como para producir una obra determinada. O sea que el hecho de juntar ambos clasificaciones y hacerlos de manera cruzada es de por sí ya una forma de manipulación ideológica de dejar por fuera el arte. Lo importante es que el arte popular, las enormes manifestaciones de sectores que se encuentran excluidos de una participación plena, ya sea en lo social, en lo económico, en lo político fundamentalmente, y tienen una aparición restringida en la escena pública, que es lo que podemos nosotros considerar lo popular, tienen formas y sensibilidades distintas que coinciden exactamente con la definición que Occidente mismo viene manejando desde siempre en relación al arte, es decir, la posibilidad de manipular formas para, a través de ese juego de formas distintas, acrecentar la experiencia del mundo, intensificar el sentido, ampliar la posibilidad de comprender mejor, no sé si comprender, sentir a través de la comprensión mejor cómo se nos abre y se nos manifiesta el mundo. Y por eso yo considero no tanto como una necesidad de justificar el uso del término arte indígena, podríamos simplemente hablar hechos distintos, pero creo que resulta conveniente por muchos sentidos. Primero, por lo que acabo de exponer, corresponden a una definición común de lo que Occidente mismo reconoce como arte. En segundo lugar, puede significar un apoyo a la autopercepción de los distintos sectores populares excluidos, de que al ser considerados como grandes creadores y creadoras, no solamente son vistos como los últimos depositarios de la miseria social, que lamentablemente lo son en muchísimos casos, los grandes excluidos, discriminados, olvidados y explotados, sino también grandes creadores. Y eso tiene que ver también con una posibilidad en un mundo cada vez más globalizado de tener. Ayer estaban hablando acá mismo de la alegría, el contento que sienten creadores, artistas indígenas, de sentirse partícipes de una escena que los reconoce como tales. Pero yo creo que el gran aporte del arte indígena, los grandes aportes, ameritan fundamentalmente desde la posibilidad que tienen las culturas indígenas de moverse al margen de esa dolorosa escisión, esa dolorosa separación que tiene la cultura occidental entre materia y forma, espíritu y cuerpo, arte y contenido, arte, sociedad, etc. Entonces hay como, por una parte, un continuo movimiento, un flujo de devenir que desconoce esas oposiciones absolutas, incluso se habló ayer también, entre la posición del ser humano y su inserción en el ambiente, que normalmente en cualquier cultura, sobre todo indígenas, las relaciones entre el ser humano y el animal, vegetal, el mundo, son siempre fluentes, y las posibilidades que tienen los chamanes de transitar entre esos espacios tan ontológicamente separados en la cultura occidental. Lo mismo lo que tiene que ver con la sensibilidad, lo mismo, y la inteligencia, pensar, sentir a través del cuerpo y a través de determinadas maneras de comprender el mundo sensorial, sensitiva, incluso eróticamente, dan una posibilidad de moverse con naturalidad entre ámbitos que llegan a quizá resolver, no sé si llamar resolver, pero sí asumir de modo distinto la gran contradicción que tiene el arte occidental, que es la paradoja de la representación, ¿verdad? El arte indígena pasa directamente de los significantes, significados, representados, representante, en el círculo ceremonial, voy a hablar de lo indígena en este caso, cuando se representa a un Dios, no se es ese Dios en ese momento, o no se está representando un animal, se es ese animal y se vuelve a su ser animal o humano o mortal, siempre ya mediado por la máscara y habiendo transitado un espacio ontológicamente prohibido por Occidente. Bueno, para terminar, quiero referirme a 3 palabras en tupí guaraní que dan cuenta de esas transiciones y esos devenires, así como también tan sugerentemente se planteó ayer algunas palabras que dan cuenta de esa posibilidad de compartir y fluir. En guaraní, en tupí guaraní, la palabra porá quiere decir bello, pero también bueno al mismo tiempo. Con eso es un poco saldar esa dicotomía dolorosa entre ética y estética que continuamente está como trastornando o preocupando nuestros haceres. Lo bueno y bello son distintas formas de nombrar lo mismo. El arte es bueno en cuanto es bello y viceversa. Pero también porá, el verbo, decir la palabra bello, bueno, también quiere decir po es mano y ra es para la mano. O sea, estar a la mano en el sentido casi heideggeriano del término. Lo bello, lo bueno, se puede alcanzar. Como también se puede alcanzar el Ubumarané, que es la tierra prometida, el ideal utópico ideal. Lo ideal puede ser alcanzado. Habla de una posibilidad de lo posible, porque los pueblos indígenas también cuestionan la linealidad del tiempo concebido en modelo progresivo, en modelo evolutivo del progreso capitalista y encuentran presentes que todavía no fueron, futuros que ya no han sido, pasados que quizás nunca serán. O sea, en tupí guaraní, en castellano, en español, posiblemente en nuestras lenguas occidentales existen pasado, presente, futuro. En tupí guaraní existen 14 modos de tiempo. Lo que podría ser, lo que pudo no haber sido, lo que ya fue, lo que estaría siendo, pero se hace esperar, etc. Hay una modulación de la temporalidad que admite el tiempo de lo posible, también con mucho más posibilidad y casi diría con alegría. Otra palabra que está relacionada con eso es la palabra ñe'e. Ñe'e en tupí guaraní o en tupinambá también en parte quiere decir al mismo tiempo palabra y alma, pero no alma en el sentido cristiano, sino alma como fuerza, como energía. O sea, el ñe'e es al mismo tiempo significante y significado. Es el decir y el contenido de ese decir. Es la fuerza que avala y sostiene la palabra. O sea, prácticamente acá hay una síntesis, no sé llamar síntesis, pero un vínculo entre forma y contenido, o entre materia y forma, que es un gran aporte, ¿no? Entonces, por ejemplo, decir ñe'e porá, el decir bello, hermoso, es como la palabra que sería el arte, la traducción de arte, ¿no? Que sería la palabra o la forma embellecida por la verdad que sustenta, verdad en el sentido de contenido, de fundamento del decir, ¿verdad? Y es en el fondo la palabra de los chamanes, de los sabios, de los poetas, de los artistas en general. Me gustaría ahora pasar algunas imágenes, solamente 3, que obras que se están exponiendo en la Bienal para referirme muy rápidamente a algunas cuestiones de las que yo estuve hablando. Una es la referente al manto tupinambá, el manto tupí guaraní usado antes de la colonia, un manto enteramente hecho de plumas rojas de guacamayo, de guaá, que es un ave, como un ave metáxico, comunicación entre los humanos y los poderes sobrenaturales. La siguiente, por favor. Esta obra es tomada en la representación de Gliceria Tupinambá y tiene como diversos elementos. Por una parte hace una mención, una recuperación a ese manto plumario que había sido extinguido naturalmente y llevado a un museo europeo, creo que devuelto de nuevo al Brasil en este momento, ¿verdad? Y también hace referencia al Caapuera. Caapuera son territorios aparentemente devastados, destruidos, que mantienen un potencial de reverdecer, ¿verdad? Entonces hay como una potencia, casi en el sentido spinociano del término, de volver a actualizarse una fuerza dormida, como una metáfora de resistencia fuerte, y una relación con aves que también suelen ser llamadas capuera, en ese sentido, que son potencias de resistencia. En guaraní, capuera es el campo seco que espera despertarse. Pero también deriva muchas palabras de capoeira, en ese capoeira misma tiene que ver con ella, ¿no? Pero es tanto una relación a la lucha por el territorio, a una resistencia política, a quizá el momento micropolítico más fuerte del arte es siempre la espera de un tiempo o la posibilidad de un tiempo diferente, de un tiempo que parece hoy clausurado y que se mantiene como pura posibilidad. Esta es una de las obras. La siguiente, por favor. Como muchas etnias indígenas, el dibujo no era una práctica propia, sino que supone un movimiento de transculturación, de adopción, y en la medida en que esa adopción está hecha desde dentro, puede estar filtrada, elaborada a partir de las subjetividades, de los códigos, del sentido, del espacio y el tiempo, y de una cantidad enorme de significaciones que ayer fueron muy bien planteadas y que significan ese poder del arte indígena de estar absorbiendo muchas capas de significación que tienen que ver con movimientos míticos, chamánicos, micropolíticos, territoriales, actuales, su concepto mismo de la tecnología moderna, su concepto del espacio, que siempre está cribado por un modelo de espacio que comienza a ser cada vez más interesante para el arte, que no es tanto una geometría euclidiana, sino topológica, que tiene muchos puntos. No hay un punto central, sino que es un espacio que se abre y se plantea en distintas dimensiones y obviamente hacia un tiempo o a tiempos que son diferentes. De modo que es la enorme complejidad de un arte que no está copiando o que no está visto como estaba pensado el arte latinoamericano. Digo latinoamericano porque es el que yo conozco como una copia segundona del arte europeo, sino como una posibilidad de reelaborar, y en ese sentido el movimiento antropofágico brasilero fue fundamental, de asimilar y elaborar de acuerdo a otras subjetividades, a otros deseos, a otras preocupaciones, a otros saberes y otras filosofías del mundo. La siguiente, por favor. La siguiente imagen. También un artista, Julia Isidres, que está exponiendo aquí, y que es el caso de artistas de origen rural campesino que proviene directamente de un entronque guaraní, tupí guaraní, con el cual se relaciona y sigue las mismas técnicas de cocción, de cerámica que se utilizaban en las culturas originarias, pero dan completamente otra interpretación, aún manteniendo esas técnicas, reencauzan en otros sistemas y otras institucionalidades del arte y también plantean una cuestión que a mí me parece importante en el arte indígena sobre todo, también el popular en general. Yo entiendo lo indígena dentro de lo popular. Si lo popular tiene que ver con sectores que no tienen una participación plena en la escena pública, evidentemente los indígenas son parte quizá más intensa y más dolorosa de esa adscripción popular. Y una de esas características es que también entre las muchas oposiciones binarias que se ponen en jaque o que se diluyen, es incluso la oposición moderno-contemporáneo. El arte es evidentemente contemporáneo en cuanto es hecho hoy, discute con su propio tiempo y cómo pone su propia sensibilidad en discutir con su presente, en inadaptarse incluso a su presente, como quiere Heidegger que sea una de las características del arte, no aceptar sumisamente su tiempo, ¿verdad? Por una parte, y también rompe las categorías moderno-contemporáneo. Esto podría haber sido una obra perfectamente moderna. Muchas de las formas que estamos viendo tienen que ver una preocupación por la forma que es típicamente moderna, y sin embargo, al reconectarla con otros niveles de significación, también están como poniendo en oscilación esa dicotomía demasiado tajante con que muchas veces nosotros manejamos lo contemporáneo por oposición a lo moderno. Bueno, estas son las cuestiones que quería plantear. Muchísimas gracias por la atención.
Thank you so much, Ticio, again. Our next speaker is the wonderful Miguel Lopez, who is a writer and currently co-curator of the 2024 Toronto Biennial of Art. He is also the chief curator of Museo Universitario del Chopo in Mexico City. Before that, Miguel ran a wonderful space in Costa Rica in San Juan called Teoretica, and has been really a crucial figure in the reconceptualization of and thinking around conceptualism in Latin America. I would like to mention his groundbreaking work on the artists Teresa Burga, for example, and also Cecilia Vicuña. So thank you so much for joining us today, Miguel. It is wonderful to have you here.
Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Adriano, Amanda, Sofia, Ilaria, and the whole team for inviting me to participate in the meetings on art. I am really grateful to be here among friends and colleagues. I also want to express my gratitude to Rember Yawarkani for the insightful conversations about his work and his father's work for this presentation. Well, as Sofia said, my name is Miguel Lopez. I am a curator from Lima, Peru, currently, temporarily based in Toronto. And the title of this presentation is Shifting the Path, Roselena Kurucic, Santiago Yawarkani, and Rember Yawarkani. This presentation discusses creative practices from the Americas that emerge outside the canonic and established Western art worlds, often labeled as primitivist, amateur, or naive. Much indigenous art and art practices informed by vernacular culture have been disregarded in avant-garde and high modernist historiographies due to the absence of skilled professionalism. I want to focus here on 3 artists currently exhibited at Biennale Arte 2024. First, I will talk about the late Maya Cachiquel painter Rosalena Curruchiche, who is considered the first female painter of San Juan Comalapa in Guatemala. Secondly, I will talk about the Witoto painters from the northern Amazonia, Santiago Yahuarcani and Rember Yahuarcani. Rember presented a really powerful lecture yesterday. Rosalena, Santiago, and Rember did not have art school credentials or formal fine art training. They gained and developed their artistic knowledge within their families and communities. Through their works, they renegotiated their positions within their own cultural context and developed visual languages that challenge conventional aesthetic markers and categories. Oh, sorry, this is the first. Rosalena Curruchiche is regarded as the first, as the first female painter in San Juan Comalapa, Guatemala, and I wanted to start by showing this map of Comalapa in Central America. Comalapa is a small rural town in Guatemala's western highlands. It has a total population of approximately 50,000 inhabitants. The majority, 94% more or less, of the population belongs to the indigenous group of Cachiquel Maya, with Cachiquel as the official language. Rosalena was born in 1958 and taught herself to paint in the mid-1970s. Her meticulous miniature paintings depict traditional customs, religious festivities, artisanal traditions, and also personal and family scenes. A characteristic of her work is a detailed representation of Maya textiles. She often portrays, as here for example, domestic interiors with walls covered in indigenous blankets and women wearing traditional huipiles, the hand-woven Maya garments worn across Central America and Mexico. She started to paint by observing the work of her grandfather, Andrés Curruchiche, who became the most renowned painter in Comalapa and gained international recognition in the 1950s. And these 2 paintings by Andrés and Rosalena are currently on display at the Giardini. Andrés, recognized as the first Maya Cachiquel, Andrés, recognized as the first Maya Cachiquel oil painter, achieved success by exhibiting his work in Guatemala City and having solo shows in San Francisco, Dallas, Illinois, and Detroit in the US between 1956 and 1959. His exhibition at the De Jong Museum in San Francisco was widely acclaimed, attracting over 90,000 visitors in 4 weeks, leading to a 7-week extension, as reported in this article from the Guatemalan newspaper, El Imparcial. Andrés' fame catalyzed Comalapa to become a center for Mayan art and home to hundreds of artists, many of whom were trained by the artist himself. Rosalena was born during Andrés' international popularity peak. He passed away in 1969 when she was 11 years old. She decided to become a painter in the following years, but her desire was not entirely well received. In Comalapa, painting was considered an exclusive masculine tradition. Although there are conflicting versions, local researchers have pointed out that family members especially Rosalena's husband, strongly opposed her dedication to painting, leading to feelings of rejection and isolation. According to researchers Linda Asturias de Barrios and Mónica Berger, Rosalena felt harshly critiqued and saw pressure that she even changed her address and moved to another location. The small size of curatrici paintings was a response to the fact that much of her work was created in secret. Rosalena's work was only exhibited once in Guatemala. During her lifetime, paintings did not receive exposure outside of the country, except for her participation in the Santa Fe International Folk Art Market in 2004, thanks to her friendship with the photographer and writer Anna Livingston Paddock, who promoted her work in Santa Fe. After Rosalena's sudden passing in 2005, at the age of 48, Anna donated 7 of her miniature paintings to the Museum of International Folk Art in New Mexico. I first encountered her work in January 2018 at La Galería, an indigenous-founded commercial gallery in Panajachel, a small town on the shores of Lake Atitlan in Guatemala. The gallery was established by Mayan painter Nancuz in 1972 and was one of the first commercial art galleries in Guatemala and Central America. In 2017, La Galería received several boxes of Rosalena's paintings to sell on behalf of a family who collected her works. And that is a few pictures that one of them I took from that visit. From that year until 2023, La Galería hosted what they call a permanent exhibition of Rosalena Curruchiche, which brought new attention to her paintings. Together with friends and colleagues, we brought some of her paintings to Costa Rica. The nonprofit art space Teoretica in Costa Rica, where I worked as a chief curator and co-director at that time, organized her first international solo show after her death in March 2019, as part of a series dedicated to pioneer women artists in Central America. We had planned to exhibit it later in her hometown, Comalapa, but the pandemic made it impossible. The main argument of the exhibition was that Rosalena's art was not simply documents to be interpreted from an ethnographic lens. She had a particular way of looking that was not always focused on reflecting the present time, but rather on observing the historical transformation of social relations during decades when indigenous cultures and the existing communal structures were being suppressed or absorbed into Western culture. She started to paint in the late 1970s during a period of intense civil war that affected the Maya indigenous peoples at a genocidal level. Her paintings focus on collective work dynamics and communal collaborations, particularly women's labor. Her paintings rarely depicted individualized characters separated from the natural world, territory, and sometimes protective spirits. Here, for example, we see the community asking for protection to the spirit of the mountain. They stress the importance of active participations of all members of society in communal activities to gain access and the right to be part of a community. And here we see, for example, a group of female lumberjacks in preparation for a local festivity. By depicting collective life forms, she highlighted the interconnected relationships and joint production of value by people and nature, and beyond or in parallel to increasingly capitalist social structures. Presentando a las mujeres que construyen casitas, introducing women that build houses, is a remarkable example of the artist's emphasis on women's leadership. The portrait is colorful and cheerful, with textiles again taking center stage. Much of her paintings reflect on the complex gender arrangements within communal social systems that exceeds a more traditional gendered vision of labor. Her paintings confront the overrepresentation of men in positions of power and public life. Andres Kurucic's painting from 1940 shows a town festival featuring the popular game of a person climbing a grease pole with mainly men in the public square. On the right, we see Rosalena's painting depicting a similar scene with a majority of women in the public space. This is a painting of a women's committee that is responsible for ensuring the access to drinking water in the community. Rosalena insisted in representing women leading assemblies and collective modes of organization. The Maya Quiche activist and sociologist Gladys Schulschul has reflected on the limits of liberal feminism and how, prior to feminism, what took place in indigenous communities was doing among women, hacer entre mujeres. The author, Schulschul, emphasizes the importance of women's politics in organizing both personal and collective aspects of life, which goes beyond the use of women's identity by the state. Much of Rosalena's paintings also focus on the matrilineal continuation of indigenous knowledge systems, such as textile making and its historical meanings and beauty. Most weavers are taught at a young age by their mothers, grandmothers, and aunts. In other works, Rosalena also depicts how women navigated through machismo, illustrating communal forms of justice administration, as seen in this painting on the right. She portrayed herself participating in different activities. In one self-portrait, she is shown selling candy at a local festival, a skill she learned as a child to economically help her family. Another painting depicts her making tortillas, demonstrating how her artistic endeavors were connected to daily activities like cooking, sewing, and taking care of others. One of Rosalena's most moving works depicts herself as a baby or as an infant, gazing at her grandfather, Andres Kurucic, through a window. We can only see the top of his hat, but it's evident that he's painting a landscape with a blue sky. Here we have the detail. The work emphasizes knowledge transfer across generations, even though Andres didn't formally train Rosalena. In creating this piece, she sought to recognize her position within a non-Western art tradition, a lineage of indigenous painters from Comalapa. However, she also altered the course of this tradition by overcoming the barriers women face in pursuing certain art forms. Her determination to paint is even more evident here. She portrayed herself painting in a rural setting, departing from the usual depictions of community customs in favor of landscape painting, which is a significant style in Comalapa. Unlike most of her paintings, she is here alone, surrounded only by crops and her painting tools. Her left arm extends over the canvas, which in this case, appears larger than the miniature formats she usually uses. She wears a Mayan huipil, a green dress, and her hair is tied in a braid. I see this painting as a defiant and affirmative representation of her right to engage in painting. Despite facing initial scrutiny and opposition, Rosalena created a space for herself to express her imagination, even when her work wasn't displayed in art spaces and mostly circulated discreetly among friends and those who bought her miniatures for almost 2 decades. She reclaimed painting as a form of self-determination. Her passion and tenacity paved the way for other Mayan women's painters to follow. Santiago and Rember Yawarkani. Santiago Yawarkani and his son, Rember Yawarkani, are Witoto painters from northern Amazonia. I am starting with a map again to situate ourselves geographically in South America, near the triple border between Peru, Colombia, and Brazil. Pebas, where they live, is a small town on the banks of the Ampillacu River, which is considered to have curative properties due to the concentration of medicinal plants along its serpentine course. The Ampillacu is one of hundreds of minor tributaries of the Amazon River. And this is recent pictures of Santiago's place in Tebas. And this is part of his studio, the place where he paints while lying on the floor. Santiago and Rember's paintings are a testament to the consciousness, affection, and intelligence of the territory and its inhabitants, communicating in a way that invites us to hear beyond the parameters of settler coloniality. And this is one of the paintings currently exhibited at the Arsenale. And this is a painting by Rember, also exhibited at the Arsenale. Combining symbolic or descriptive references to colonial violence and spiritual worlds, they encapsulate the memories of his ancestors, or their ancestors, the sacred knowledge of medicinal plants, the voices of the elders, and Amazonian stories of life's origins, all in a manner that demands attention and respect. Santiago began painting at the age of 10. In the 1980s, he started creating paintings and wooden sculptures to sell to tourists near his hometown, where he still lives and works. Although the initial motivation for his creations was economical subsistence, these works were a repository of collective memory and intricate representations of Witoto worldviews. Rember, his son, started very young as well. He learned with his father to prepare natural dyes and the yanchama, the bark cloth used as a surface for the paintings. The stories told by his grandmother, Marta Lopez, were influential to Rember, to the point that many of his works honors his spiritual connection with her. It is important to mention that Santiago's wife, Rember's mother, Nereida Lopez, is also an artist. Following the tradition of mass production, she works with natural fibers and wood taken from the forest to represent many characters portrayed in the myths her grandparents told her. Santiago's symbolic universe, born from his desire to preserve the storytelling and knowledge systems of the Witoto people. His mother, Marta Lopez Pinedo, was a descendant of Gregorio Lopez, the only member of the Aymeni clan, the White Heron clan, el clan de la Garza Blanca, who moved from La Chorrera, which is now part of the Colombian Amazon, to the Ampillacu River in now northern Peru. Santiago's grandfather, Gregorio, was one of the survivors of the Putumayo genocide. During this time, almost 30,000 indigenous people from the Bora, Witoto, Andoque, and Ocaina nations were brutally killed by the Peruvian Amazon Company at the height of the rubber boom in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. This series actually shows that episode of ethnic cleansing as transmitted orally by the artist's grandfather. Although the rubber business ceased to be profitable around the late 1920s, similar practices of subjugation and extraction continued to devastate indigenous populations and destroy the Amazon. But unlike Rosalena Currucich, Santiago Yaborcani's painting made their way to art spaces. His work began to be featured in art exhibitions in Lima in the late 2000s. This path was paved by alternative cultural infrastructures that aimed to amplify the voices of Amazonian artists, and by his son's determination to insert the work of both of them in a local art scene that was predominantly defined by Western art parameters. In 2003, Santiago's paintings made their first public appearance in Lima. And this is an example of one of Santiago's earliest work. It's an early painting from 2005. His son, Rember, in 2003, represented his father in a cultural event in the city and brought some of Santiago's paintings from Pebas. According to the curator, Gretna Landolt, the paintings were initially offered as craft in an artisan market organized by the Mincetur, the Minister of Foreign Trade and Tourism, at the Desamparados station, a former railway station transformed into a cultural space. The market was presented on the second floor, while the first floor hosted one of the first ambitious exhibitions dedicated to the Amazon. However, Santiago's paintings were not formally part of it. The exhibition, Serpiente de Agua, La Vida Indígena en la Amazonía, Serpent of the Waters, Indigenous Life in the Amazon, curated by Gretna Landolt and Alexander Surayes, showcase a wide range of artistic expression from different Amazon nations to emphasize the importance of preserving this heritage, driven by the goal of creating a society that respects and acknowledges the rights and contributions of indigenous communities. The project, like other exhibitions at that time, was approached through an anthropological lens. In the book's introduction, the authors acknowledge, and I quote, "We, as curators of the exhibits and authors of this catalog, limit ourselves to transcribing the ways of indigenous peoples as accurately as possible, based on our professional experiences in the arts and anthropology." End of quote. During Rember's first visit to Lima, he met with art historians, researchers, and curators, such as Victoria Morales, Gretna Landolt, Nancy Herrera, and Luis Elvira Belaunde, among others, with whom he later developed some collaborations. Nancy Herrera invited Rember to exhibit his work at the National Library the following year, in 2004, marking his first solo show in Lima. A year later, in 2005, Gretna Landolt published El Ojo que Cuenta, Eyes That Tell, which included paintings and stories by Santiago and Rember. However, within the official contemporary art circuit, non-fine art practices and non-Western aesthetics were often viewed as craft with little cultural value. Rember was troubled by the status that indigenous artists held in a local art world governed by discriminatory standards of race, class, and gender. Even Even if his paintings began to be accepted, he felt that his art was being labeled as indigenous art based on ethnographic expectations of how native art should appear. He perceived some of this acceptance as containing racist condescension and aimed to participate in the contemporary art scene to challenge these hierarchies and change the terms of that conversation. In 2006, Santiago and Rembert began exhibiting their work together. That year, they presented Amazonía, traducciones pictóricas de la cultura Witoto, Amazonia, pictorial translations from Witoto culture, at a public art gallery in the Miraflores district of Lima, which is one of the wealthiest districts and one of the epicenters of the contemporary art scene. Around that time, Rembert took on a more protective role of Santiago and his work, aiming to challenge what he perceived as academic control of indigenous aesthetics by anthropologists and curators. In 2008, Rembert presented Yanchamas, Solo Pieles, the first solo show by an indigenous painter in a commercial contemporary art gallery in Lima, marking a significant milestone in the relationship between indigenous art, the mainstream art circuit, and the market. And this is one of the paintings that Rembert exhibited at the gallery in 2008. In July 2009, Santiago and Rembert's paintings were featured in a group exhibition in Buenos Aires, and in December of that year, 2009, they opened a show called 11 Lunas, 11 Moons, at the Municipality Art Gallery in Lima. Rembert sought to encourage a dialogue between father and son as a means of learning and to highlight how indigenous Amazonian knowledge is passed down through generations. 11 Moons reflected the Witoto representations of time. Instead of using the Gregorian calendar, which numbers its years in the Western Christian era, the Witoto people pay attention to 11 fruits that allow them to count the time between the beginning of each summer season. In these works, Rembert showcased a distinct pictorial style, transitioning from the narrative approach of his early paintings to large-scale, dreamlike landscapes that blend Western art techniques with indigenous stories. And here you can see two paintings that illustrate this change of his vocabulary between 2004 and 2009. Significant changes have occurred between 2010 and now. However, I wanted to focus on the initial period as it shows a glimpse of Santiago and Rembert's negotiation processes between amateur and professional spaces and identities, which aim to advance self-determination. Over the past decade, their work has garnered local and international recognition, which Rembert has been leveraging to carve out spaces for conversation among indigenous peers and foster native-led organized exhibition. And this is a view of a recent exhibition curated by Rembert in Lima. The increasing visibility of Rembert and Santiago's paintings, as well as the efforts of curators and researchers, have sparked conversations that led to a significant reassessment of art categories, museum narratives, and collective policies in Peru. And I will conclude with this. Positioned outside the mainstream of fine art professionalism, Roselena, Santiago, and Rembert were conscious of and respected their place within broader indigenous creative traditions. They also recognized the opportunity to change and reshape this path. In other words, they didn't want it to be absorbed into a single tradition, but instead wanted to deconstruct existing colonial categories and introduce a visual vocabulary that challenged social segregation and the limitations of cultural contexts. Rosa Elena identified with a legacy of indigenous painters initiated by her grandfather, Andres Curatrici, but sought to expand that lineage and challenge a symbolic masculine representation order. Santiago uses his art to preserve Witoto memories and storytelling that are constantly threatened by an ongoing climate catastrophe and a long history of colonial dispossession that began with the eradication of indigenous spiritual worlds. Rember's work engages in conversation and expansion of his father's practice by offering dreamlike personal interpretations where Witoto stories, heritage, and futurity are explored through an abstract language. Operating within the so-called amateur cultural realms, their visual languages deeply challenge the traditional markers and Eurocentric art parameters used by art institutions that historically excluded non-white subjects and lower classes from equal participation in the cultural sphere. Their work not only honors their indigenous ancestors and local creative traditions by revisiting and expanding them, but also reshuffles the conventional boundaries of our history and the established art world as a whole. Thank you.
And our final speaker for the day is Rodrigo Mura, a curator, editor, and writer who is currently chief curator of El Museo del Barrio in New York, which is the first museum to be dedicated to Latinx and Latin American culture in the United States. The museum, in fact, loaned to us here at the Biennale an outstanding number of arpilleras, which are sewn works by Chilean artists that you can see in the exhibition. Rodrigo previously was director at the monumental sculpture park in Belo Horizonte in Brazil called Inochin, and it is my wonderful honor to welcome him to the stage today. Thank you very much. Rodrigo.
Grazie tanto, muito obrigado, many thanks, Adriano Pedrosa, Sofia Gotti, Amanda Carneiro for the lovely invitation and for the hard work on this important exhibition. An exhibition we hope will have a lasting impact on how we understand the art system and the power structures. Thanks also to Ilaria Zanelli and Francesca Montorio for their help in organizing this wonderful symposium. My initial considerations this evening will look at the intersection between two of this week's panels, part of the meetings on art. I'm reading this panel synopsis of today and tomorrow, and I'm noticing a very interesting relationship between them, a converging asymmetry that hopefully will prepare you for my brief presentation that will follow. Allow me to quickly read this synopsis. Arte Popular. The outsider artist, the self-taught artist, and the figure of the so-called artista popular in Latin America are among those artistic subjectivities that have been excluded or marginalized from the grand narratives of modernism and contemporary art. Speakers in this panel present curatorial and scholarly perspectives that have blurred the boundaries between fine and applied art or craft, making way for the vernacular and the popular. Modernisms. The work of modernist artists from the global south demands a radical revision of modernist art histories. Committed to its radical reimagination, This panel explores, tomorrow's panel that is, modernism beyond Europe, its intersection with colonialism, diaspora, and migration, and how it was reshaped by local and indigenous perspectives. So what I plan to do today is to briefly walk you through these two categories, modern and popular, and see how they intersect, specifically in the case of Brazilian art of the 20th century, and in a more tentatively expansive way across the Americas. The historical framework that I will use is the one of Brazilian modernities and modernisms and of their art institutions. So I'm not referring here to arte popular or arte popular, a term widely used, especially from the 1950s onwards, to identify artists that were crossing the boundaries between crafts and the so-called fine arts. That would be such a fascinating topic as the term arte popular and artiste popular, coined by art historians, have a rich genealogy and a potential comparative history in places like Brazil, Peru, and Mexico. But that's not what I'm doing today. I am rather looking on how ideas of the popular entered the works of a few painters that have worked in the margins of mainstream modernism, but have nonetheless challenged the institutions of their time and engaged in fertile dialogues with official agents of the circuit, such as critics, museum directors, and other artists. They have resisted the imposition of an European art history and have created strategies of questioning the insertion of the artists in the system beyond the elitist structures that had prevailed. The first group we'll examine are constituted by Agostinho Batista de Freitas, Janira da Mota Silva, José Antônio da Silva, and Heitor dos Prazeres, among others. Before we move into other curatorial projects I proposed or have been involved with in the last years. What brings these artists together is the fact that they all belong to an emerging working class in Brazil that related to the emergence of free labor with the so-called abolition of enslavement in 1888. It was Professor Angela Miller during a symposium hosted by the American Folk Art Museum of New York in 2003, where I also presented, who synthesized some of my interests in bringing them together. I quote her, "Brazilian painters of the vernacular world of everyday work, the beginnings of a collective energy of change. Nurtured by a growing labor movement, they found the confidence to claim an indigenous ownership of culture, one that transformed Brazil from a colonial society of Europe to one that summoned recognition by nationalizing institutions of art as they grappled with the inherited canons of modernism. These artists vaulted across the considerable class divisions within Brazil and the legacies of a very elitist art world to take on high art institutions. These artists," I quote ended, have also been prejudicially labeled as primitive, naive, and self-taught, which are obviously reductive terms that reveal a limitation of the art world structure of their time, if not pure and simple racism and classism. The talk could start in so many points, but as an homage or a tribute to the work of Adriano Pedrosa at MASP and our fecund exchanges when I work as an adjunct curator of Brazilian art there, and also the importance of Museu de Arte de São Paulo, Museu de Arte de São Paulo in advancing conversations about the popular in art, past and present, I like to start with this show I co-curated with Fernando Oliva at MASP in 2016. Displayed within the frank and direct architecture designed by Lina Bobardi, the show was a part of a major wide-scope program developed by MASP aimed at questioning the concepts of high and low art and culture. These strategies were also giving rise to the restaging of the exhibition A Mão do Povo Brasileiro, The Hand of Brazilian People, one of the most celebrated and controversial exhibitions ever held by the museum, and as well as organizing shows as Portinari Popular, which forced in the reading of popular themes in Brazilian modernism. The biography of Batista de Freitas, the artist on the screen here, is intertwined with the history of MASP and the city of São Paulo itself. It was the museum founding director, Pietro Maria Bardi, who introduced the work, the artist's work, into the art circuit by organizing his first solo show in 1952. Batista de Freitas was then just 20 years old, and he was living in Imirim, which is in São Paulo North Zone, in the periphery of the city, painting and showing his work in the streets of downtown São Paulo, where Bardi first met him. So the encounter of the two men offers him a gesture of elevation. There's an anecdote that Agostinho was showing his paintings on the streets of São Paulo, and Bardi supposedly asked him, as narrated by Bardi himself, asked him to create a specific painting, and as a gesture of elevation, he would grant him access to the top of the tallest building in the city at that time, so that from this vantage point, he could create a trial painting, a view of downtown São Paulo. This is the painting we have on our left, which belonged to Bardi, to his private collection. This building symbolizes the very system of art itself in São Paulo at that time. Should Batista de Freitas succeed in this challenge, an even higher Olympus would be granted to him, an exhibition at MASP. The focus here on that show was on depictions of the city of São Paulo, a subject that occupied Batista de Freitas throughout his career. These paintings also speak of the perversities of the São Paulo modernization process, with the views of São Paulo economic boom, being very rarely populated, convoking notions of work alienation and exploitation. Batista de Freitas was also an electrician for MASP for many years, which is an important part of his biography and an interesting aspect of his relationship with an institution. So an essential part of that project at that time was the publication of an extensive catalog with reproduction of all the artworks in the exhibition. So this was, something that was rarely done, and also 6 commission essays, which initiated an important path in new art historical approach on artists marginalized by the official art history up to that point. The next artist that I'll present, which was also the other show that I was involved with at MASP, touching on these questions, is Janira da Mota Silva. This show, titled A Picture in Brazil, was co-created with Isabella Rigel in 2019. Janira, it's a very interesting case in Brazilian modern art. She was an artist with almost no formal training, taking very few drawing classes early in her career in Rio. She was also a seamstress, and she cooked at a boarding house that some people say it belonged to her, but there's very little evidence that this was the case. But in any case, she was living in Santa Teresa, a vibrant artistic neighborhood in Rio during the Second World War, when many other artists fleeing World War II were also living there. And this likely contributed to shaping her artistic sensibilities, sort of navigating different art worlds of that time. So in an interesting way, Janira was not only self-taught, but she was also in a way self-made, and her work was infused with a lot of identity tropes. And she was, so this is, part of the editorial process of MASP, of creating the type of scholarship that these works did not merit in the past or did not have in the past. So this is the cover of the catalog. But also we see there a spread of my essay where we have these comparative illustrations where you see how she was very aware of the popular thematic in modern movements in Brazil of the 1920s and 30s with paintings by of Tarsila and Cândido Portinari, 2 other more canonical artists, whose works were highly infused with the themes of the popular in labor and also popular festivities, as we can see in these comparative illustrations. Janira has had a brief but very meaningful sojourn in New York, where she arrived in 1945 with no money at all. But she was following another when she was following another Brazilian painter, Milton da Costa, as they were in a romantic relationship at the time. Da Costa had won a travel prize of the Brazilian salons, where Janira had shown between 1940 and 1945, which is how she really paved her way into the official art world with this subsequent participations in the Brazilian National Art Salon, which was an institution then relatively newly created by the Estado Novo and the laborist government of Getúlio Vargas. During her time in New York, Janira had a show at the New School of Social Research, and her archives that are now in Funarte in Rio de Janeiro include several clippings of her time in New York City. So this painting is an example of the work she started to develop when she came back to Brazil. This is from the 1950s, how she continued to represent labor in a rural Brazilian setting, but also brought it together to mid to late 1950s to a more geometric and constructivist style, again engaging with different art trends of that moment in an interesting pendular movement. This newspaper clipping from 1958, Mario Pedrosa, the art critic Mario Pedrosa, recounts that during his visit to the studio of the Brazilian artist Janira, he was prompted to reconsider the issue of landscape in the pictorial representation of the country. In his view, Alfredo Volpi, another artist that whose work we're going to see in a minute, conceived a masterful solution to the urban and suburban image through essential plastic elements that highlight their immense artistic value in interpreting a local landscape that encompasses the entire nation. So this is an interesting moment where these ideas of the national and the popular intersect in the work of these artists, and specifically through the reading of Mario Pedrosa, who was widely read and mainstream critic of the time. While other painters focus solely on chromatic recording, atmosphere, and the external visualization of Brazil, achieved a similar effect with considerable originality. This phenomenon, according to Pedrosa, reveals the significant objectivity of certain pictorial problems within national production. So the title there being Problemas da Pintura Brasileira. Pedrosa had already wrote twice about Janira in the 40s, and also asking what was left of her primitivism. So the different developments of Janira faced a considerable resistance of mainstream art critics of the time. An example of how this dynamic between critics and self-taught artists takes center stage once again, but in the case of Janira there. And this is an image of a painting by Alfredo Volpi from the 1950s, around the same time, and Volpi being an artist much more canonical and much more recognized during his time. But an interesting point of reference to the other painting by Janira on how these artists were engaging with these conversations with the constructivist canon, but really coming from a lived experience perspective. In the case of Volpi, these abstractions of the facades of a vernacular construction in his neighborhood of Cambuci, and also other suburban landscapes around São Paulo, in the surroundings of São Paulo, and in the case of Janeiro that we saw before, with coffee plantations, in this case tea, but there's a number of paintings around coffee culture, agricultural activity in the rural settings of the state of Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and also south of Minas Gerais. José Antônio da Silva is perhaps the most renowned self-taught artist in the Brazilian tradition, in the Brazilian art history. He took part in the first edition of the São Paulo Biennial, an artist from the rural regions of the state of São Paulo, who worked on cotton plantations in the countryside before becoming an artist. His history follows a recurring structure of interaction between the mainstream and so-called self-taught artists, where the artists get discovered by a white male critic from a mainstream structure. In the case of Silva, he was showing his work in his hometown in an exhibition in 1946, and his paintings caught the attention of critics such as Lorival Gomes Machado and Paulo Mendes de Almeida, who were then serving as jurors to that exhibition. And immediately after that, he starts to show his work in São Paulo. 1 year later, he had a show at MASP with Bardi, and they acquired his work. The collection of the museum purchased his work. And in 1949, the Museu de Arte Moderna, Museum of Modern Art of São Paulo, published his book, which is a very interesting example of an institution actually publishing the writings of an artist, an autobiography written when he was 40 years old, narrating his upbringing and how he became an artist. Silva is a particularly intriguing artist because he was also very involved with the São Paulo Biennial. Both the Museum of Modern Art and MASP initially demonstrated interest in self-taught artists, with da Silva being an early example, but also the São Paulo Biennale in 1951 played a pivotal role in promoting and showcasing self-taught artists in their first edition. Also an interesting way of negotiating between the so-called fine arts and more Eurocentric artists or circuits and the so-called self-taught artists. Years later, Silva became very upset that he was being excluded from such exhibitions and started to produce self-portraits in which he represented himself with the sayings, the text accompanying these figures, these illustrations. Sometimes he represented the critics or jurors, and one notable self-portrait features the statement, "I hate São Paulo biennials." On the right, a detailed self-portrait shows his mouth covered with the caption, "Look at his mouth, at this mouth. It was the biennial that tied it up." So he was also referring to this, complex dynamics between the circuit and artists with a popular background. Not necessarily a harmonious relationship, but quite a complex one. Next, we're gonna briefly look at Heitor dos Prazeres, an artist native of Rio de Janeiro that became really the main theme of his paintings. His father was a carpenter and clarinetist in a military band. His mother was a seamstress. And I say this because these experiences will be very important, these community experiences will be very important to his paintings. And to his pictorial language at large. So Dos Prazeres grew up during the years following the abolishment of slavery in Brazil, a time that was marked by rural flight and vast transformations in labor and in urban life, which included the creation of the favelas, the surgimento, the emergence of the favelas in the main urban centers, pushing back the black population into marginality, as well as the emergence of samba, a musical and cultural manifestation of the African diaspora. So he was an early samba composer and a carnival designer. He was also very close to the culture of the college sambas, of Rio de Janeiro. He's a main samba figure and was a practitioner of African Brazilian religions such as Candomblé and Umbanda. These experiences inform his paintings directly, and the movement and rhythm in the figures he represents, becoming almost like continuations of dance and this culture. He began painting in the late 30s, following the death of his wife. In '51, he participated in the São Paulo Biennial and was awarded the third prize for painting for Brazilian artists, actually. And very early on, he had his work included in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, which is an interesting entry point also for the circulation of the so-called self-taught artists as part of, Lincoln Kirstein Inter-American Fund, travels to South America, the works of Heitor dos Prazeres and other artists that didn't have the official accreditation were starting to be acquired, and there was an important way on how these works started to have recognition abroad as part of especially American collections and also exhibitions in the case of both Heitor and Silva. Shortly before his death, a documentary about Heitor dos Prazeres and his art and life was directed by Antônio Carlos Fontoura. I, would love to direct you to that film. You can easily find it on YouTube. And that film opens with Heitor in his studio in downtown Rio, in the region known historically as Little Africa, and with a wonderful, striking quote, his voice in a sort of voiceover at the opening scenes. So I'll quote that in Portuguese for its beauty and linguistic nuance. Eu sou Heitor dos Prazeres, Heitor dos Prazeres é meu nome. Esse prazer que eu tenho no nome é o prazer que eu divido com o povo. Esse povo que eu reparto esse prazer. Esse povo que sofre, esse povo que trabalha, esse povo alegre que eu compartilho com a alegria desse povo. A alegria desse povo. O sofrimento desse povo é que me obriga a trabalhar, é que me faz transpor para a tela esse sofrimento do povo, esse povo que sou eu, o homem do povo. Não há nada mais sublime do que a massa humana. O povo é a massa humana, é a voz do sangue. O povo é a carne humana, o povo é o aconchego, o povo é tudo. Eu, para o povo, represento um pedaço. Eu sou o ovo, o povo é a chocadeira. I am Heitor dos Prazeres, Heitor dos Prazeres is my name. This pleasure, because his name means pleasures, prazeres, I carry in my name is the pleasure I share with the people with whom I partake this joy. These people that suffers, these people that works, these joyful people whose happiness I embrace. The joy of these people, the suffering of these people compels me to work, drives me to transcribe their pain onto my canvas. These people that I am, the man of the people, there is nothing more sublime than the human mass. The people are the human mass. It is the voice of blood. The people are the flesh of humanity. The people are warmth. The people are everything. To the people, I represent a piece. I am the egg. The people are the incubator. So this was the first part of my presentation. So now I'm going to just, very briefly walk you through a couple of more recent curatorial projects that I've been involved with or initiated. This is a show titled Popular Painters and Other Visionaries, organized at Museu del Barrio in 2022. It started as an online platform during COVID. This show really began when I was studying the collection of El Museu for, my first years there, and I realized there was a big number of works in the collection by artists working between, I would say, the late 30s and late 60s to early 70s. Artists working in different parts of the Americas and the Caribbean, and all of them gifts that had been received by the collection over recent years, but never really shown much. So we created this exhibition, bringing together these artists and departing from the term popular painters to identify artists working on the margins of modernism present in the collection, but also we expanded into a number of loans. So I know Horace Pippin, so you see this really beautiful painting by Todos Prazeres that was donated by the collection of Barbara Duncan. So a big part of these works came through a gift of the family of the late art historian and collector Barbara Duncan to our museo. And so we created these dialogues of artists that we were trying to recreate our historical connections, or just looking at how notions of diasporic culture and community play into their works and establishing dialogues between them. So this is how this wall was installed in the show. We see works by African-American artist Horace Pippin that Lynn Cook mentioned in the beginning of her presentation today, with Haiti-based, Haiti-born and Port-au-Prince painter Monsieur Stéphane, and Heitor dos Prazeres with the MoMA painting on the right. Also, we were looking into African religiosity, African diasporic religiosity as a common thread in the works of these artists, working in different latitudes around that specific historical period. So we have Rafael Borges de Oliveira on the left, which is also an artist promoted by Lina Bobardi at MASP and acquired very early on, with works by artists also from the different the Port-au-Prince School of Painting, so Jacques Ricard Chéry, Gérard Valsan, and Rigaud Benoit. Also, there was on the same this same room, we had works also dealing with this idea of visions and also spirituality in the works of three women artists, again working in common styles with finding recurrence in formal interest in their work, but not knowing of each other. So Minnie Evans working in the United States, Louisiane Saint-Florent working in Haiti, part of the Cinq Soleil School of Painting, and also Chelo González Amezcua, who's a Borderlands Tejana artist, known her for her works, her penmanship, and also was part of Miguel's presentation earlier today, the work by Andrés Curatrici that was also part of that Barbara Duncan gift that was received by the museum. It had never been shown there, so quick mention to that painting there. And just bringing it closer to the context of La Biennale. So this is the painting by Seneco Ban that's on view in the Giardini, in a room together in dialogue with works by Philomé Aubin. That was shown in dialogue with the work of Alfredo Volpe, who comes back here with this much earlier work that also speaks of this transition that was part of his language and for what he's very recognized. Lorenzato, that's a couple of, also bringing a couple of monographs that I recently worked on. This is the American-US edition of the Lorenzato monograph that I published first in Brazil. Also an artist that's here in the Biennale in the section Italians Everywhere, right? Yeah, so Italians Everywhere, where his work is presented in the glass easels of Lina Bobardi. Lorenzato is very praised for his landscapes, which are a direct result of his favelas paintings. Oops, sorry. So this is just an interesting example of how his work is being presented more recently, without never really having much institutional penetration in Brazil or much reception, other than a few participations in group shows. This is a work that's been, have been very much marketed recently. So this is an interesting example of a recent show at David Zwirner in Hong Kong, where his work is, there's a big group of his favela paintings being presented. And this is not something that we're seeing Brazilian institutions or Brazilian really scholarship around much. Maria Lira, I also wanted to bring because it's an artist that, per the synopsis, also was an artist. It's an artist from Vale do Jequitinhonha, in the northeast of Minas Gerais. An artist working in ceramics and painting, part of a long-standing tradition of female ceramicists from that region, but an artist that really is having primary market representation, and it's being shown outside those confines, you know, that confinement of artesania and artesanato that a lot of her peers were confined to. And just to end with an arpillera from, this is from El Museo's collection. It's not in the show here, but this is another, Sophia mentioned we have a number of them here in the Arsenale. But this is an example of another arpillera in the collection of El Museo del Barrio, where you see really beautiful communal scene in the center with a community workshop where we see the making of the same embroidered and applique works. And I'll finish with just this image of Maria Guzman Capron, which is an artist that's currently shown in the El Museo Trienal that we opened last week. So with that, I end today. Thank you for your attention. Should I just stay here?
So much, Rodrigo, and please everyone join us up here on stage for the Q&A. Is it going to work? Yes. Well, first of all, again, really thank you for bringing to us these presentations, which were so densely packed with research, that really also helped me focus even more on what popular art is. So we started out thinking about popular art in between categories, so connecting the indigenous, connecting the modernist, troubling these categories, existing in oscillation, which is a beautiful word Ticio was using. And maybe now I feel like I'm more visually literate about what we were looking at. And some of the motifs maybe that come through are, for example, pattern. Pattern is something that I see, that I've seen in each presentation in a different way, recurring and bringing forth tensions between abstraction and figuration, abstraction as a language that you were saying, Lynn, that really can be understood beyond that modernist tradition and even bring us into this idea of digital culture and a completely subversive language that exists within sort of also anti-hegemonic practices, which again returns back to the 1970s, to quilting, to the work of Rosa Elena, the work of Gianira, and all of these women who were really pushing the boundaries of their work. So I feel like one of the words that really sticks with me in thinking about popular art actually is anti-hegemonic, maybe. So something that really, again, questions, dismantles, reconfigures, and pushes against. But the question I want to ask everyone maybe picks up again on what was being discussed yesterday. So Amanda asked everyone about the role of identity politics in their artistic practices. And so today I'm thinking about, again, this idea of identity, but in terms of essentializing identities, essentializing terminologies that could be, for example, popular art, one limiting way of understanding art, and how sometimes these essentialisms, instead of including and reforming, actually end up excluding and disempowering those who these terms get applied to. So really the open question that I wanted to ask you is, how do we still use these words, these expressions, like these designations, like popular art? Do we still need them? Why do we still need them? And please, this is it.
Is this working? Yeah. Okay. As I said, in the US, popular arts has not really been a category, or has been not a terminology. The term used again and again, which is very unfortunate in my opinion, is outsider artist, because it has, originally its definition was of someone who is completely estranged, living in a solipsistic internal space whose creativity was internally generated, not in relation to community or context. Somebody who was socially disabled, and I mean that in the widest sense. It's totally untrue of any examples that can be given. And the person who coined it was an art historian, Roger Cardinal, and in the end, he finally backtracked and said, this is a hypothetical ideal. It was never meant to represent a particular type of creator, but it's stuck. And it remains the term, and it misrepresents. And in that sense, I think popular or popular arts may be a much better version in that it speaks to the vernacular and it speaks across class, at least hypothetically, and across gender.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for also bringing forth the question of ability, which is very important also in the exhibition itself, as we have various artists who were interned in mental institutions for most of their lives, for example.
Maybe I'm going to switch into Spanish. Is that okay? Maybe you will need to. Sí, estaba pensando que, claro, es un término complejo y yo, no, claro, creo que pienso en un término que dijo Lynn, habló de context-dependent meanings cuando estaba iniciando su presentación, y creo que este término arte popular creo que también depende mucho de los contextos. Del contexto en el cual yo provengo, que es Perú, ese término tiene una genealogía muy particular y está asociado a un proyecto, a un horizonte político socialista de los años 70 y 80 y un debate que de hecho tuvo una presencia en América Latina que se llamó la teoría social del arte, que estuvo muy presente nuevamente en 70s, 80s, en la cual se estaba intentando proponer una revisión de la noción de arte basado en un análisis de la estructura de clase de los objetos culturales, ¿no? Entonces, digamos que las posibilidades del arte popular en ese caso estaban justamente en que en tanto representaban la práctica artística de los sectores explotados de la sociedad, como lo mencionó Ticio en su presentación, estas también podían contener un deseo de modernidad y de nación distintos, ¿no? Es decir, lo que los intelectuales vieron en ese término era como una posibilidad política, ¿no? Es decir, de qué manera el arte popular o ciertas maneras de pensar el arte popular podía también configurar un sujeto político que permita construir un proyecto de nación colectivo y desde abajo, ¿no? Socialista, ¿no? Pienso en Mirko Lauer, por ejemplo, que es un teórico peruano importante de esos años, ¿no? Ahora, creo que es importante también pensar que ese término, tal como fue acuñado en el contexto en el cual yo provengo, que es Perú, ha cambiado a lo largo del tiempo porque el contexto cultural y político ha cambiado también. Ese horizonte socialista, marxista, digamos, de ese momento, que además tenía una audiencia muy específica, dejó de existir en los años 90 a partir de la implementación de un proyecto económico neoliberal en Perú y en América Latina y en el mundo en general, ¿no? Entonces, digamos que ese debate dejó de existir tal como en ese momento en Perú se estaba planteando, y el término ha ido teniendo distintas capas de sentido, ¿no? Entonces, esa, por ejemplo, es una manera de pensar la discusión del arte popular situado en ese lugar y en ese contexto. De hecho, Ticio fue parte de esas conversaciones en los años 80 muy activamente, ¿no? Pero pensaría también otra cosa, y es que ese debate muy particular en Perú, por ejemplo, estaba mirando la cultura andina como un proyecto cultural que permita redefinir el discurso nacional, ¿no? Y estaba como muy fijado en la cultura andina. Y, por ejemplo, algo como lo que Rembrandt estaba presentando ayer, ¿no? La memoria visual, filosófica, política del pueblo huitoto, en su caso, estaba completamente fuera de la discusión. Entonces yo creo que es interesante pensar cómo en realidad las estéticas, las narraciones amazónicas vienen, en el caso de Perú nuevamente, a desestabilizar esta hegemonía que tenía el discurso andino como un horizonte político que había concentrado la discusión sobre lo popular, ¿no? Entonces creo que lo amazónico perturba esa idea tradicional de lo popular. Y lo último que diría es que algo que mencionó Elvira Espejo cuando estábamos cenando ayer, un poco informalmente, es que ella sentía que estos términos eran básicamente acuñados por historiadores del arte o teóricos y que en realidad esos términos venían a nominar las prácticas de los artistas y que había una relación de jerarquía, ¿no? Entonces creo que la pregunta también es cómo volvemos a los términos que los artistas utilizan para nombrar sus prácticas, que desarman esos mapas teóricos que existen y que han sido como, que han continuado, ¿no? Y pienso en Rosalena Curruchich, por ejemplo, porque ella sí resistió al término de pintura naif en Guatemala en esos años. Ella dijo que ella era una pintora maya cachiquel, no era una pintora naif, es decir, tenía una conciencia política muy clara de dónde venía su linaje, ¿no? Entonces creo que mirar a los términos que los artistas usan como una manera de abrir otras maneras de pensar lo contemporáneo puede ser como muy importante.
Gracias, Miguel. Sí que directamente.
Bueno, yo pienso que estamos en un momento en el cual los términos tienen que ser justificados y puestos en contexto continuamente. Quizá una de las palabras más ambiguas que existe hoy sea el término arte, ¿no? ¿Qué es arte? ¿Qué límites tiene? ¿A qué se refiere? ¿A qué tradición cubre? Etcétera. Y entonces, si estamos en un momento en el cual discutimos precisamente la fijeza de las categorías y la carga metafísica de las palabras, como si fuese como una palabra está como cargada de una sustancia y prendida de ella, entonces más que nunca el nivel pragmático de los términos resulta fundamental. Si arte por su lado es problemático, popular también lo es enormemente, cumple de los populismos más grandes y va desde un uso de la derecha a la izquierda, pasa por lo democrático, pasa por lo que tiene mayor difusión masiva, tiene una cantidad enorme de acepciones. Entonces, yo creo que es importante, si hablamos de arte popular, digamos, bueno, nos estamos refiriendo a este fenómeno que tiene que ver, en mi caso particular, y yo veo en muchas obras acá en la Bienal, como formas alternativas de arte que aportan nuevas sensibilidades y que ayudan en el ámbito del arte fundamentalmente a cómo abrir nuevas perspectivas a un arte el mainstream que está como excesivamente encerrado en sí mismo y está como en una crisis bastante fuerte, ¿no? Entonces pienso que si encarado así, arte popular, que incluye el arte indígena como un arte de sectores no suficientemente representados en la escena pública, según derechos que sí los afectan, entonces tienen sensibilidades propias, tienen saberes propios, y entonces, bueno, esos saberes y esas sensibilidades también son miradas desde afuera, desde el mainstream, con mucho interés. Pues acá se plantea casi el término arte popular aparece definido desde el lado de la institucionalidad del arte, y si bien la institucionalidad del arte está en gran parte regida en términos hegemónicos y en términos de la lógica instrumental del capital, tampoco es un bloque homogéneo, ¿verdad? Hay como muchos movimientos adentro. También puede ser el arte popular usado como una moda, pero también sí como sectores aliados de los artistas populares. Y habría que ver mucho también cómo se definen los artistas indígenas. Yo escuchaba ayer, decía, nosotros nos definimos como artistas indígenas contemporáneos. Entonces esa voz de sujeto que también entra, que le interesa también entrar a una institucionalidad porque tiene que ver con sus propios intereses. Evidentemente, una institucionalidad, pongamos una bienal, tiene sus propios intereses. Los artistas también, hasta dónde se negocia eso y con qué título de sujeto. Aparentemente ahora es como una palabra así, prêt-à-porter, ad hoc, que se usa lo popular para designar lo que no está estrictamente regido en clave de mainstream. Pero hasta qué punto muchos artistas populares o artistas indígenas enseguida adquieren una cotización y un nombre enorme que crea una serie de conflictos, que va desde el caso de Jaider Esbel, el artista que se suicidó lamentablemente en una bienal de San Pablo 2 o 3 años atrás, ¿verdad? Que expresa un colapso enorme, lo que no significa necesariamente la institucionalidad mala versus artista bueno, sino son dos sujetos distintos que hay que ver cómo negocian y qué papel tiene la posibilidad de los artistas populares, y algún nombre hay que darlos, y eso parece ser una pragmática suficientemente interesante en términos de palabras, ¿no? En ese sentido yo hablo de arte popular hoy en día, sabiendo enormemente toda la historia que tiene ese arte, y muchos de los cuales no conozco, pero supongo que deben existir, ¿verdad? Y el término popular mismo es un término que hay que tomarlo con pinzas. Por eso a veces decía Didi Uberman o mismo decían, bueno, hay que usar siempre en plural, el pueblos, no pueblo, y en minúscula, no pueblo con mayúscula, y en adjetivo de ser posible, lo popular, con todos los cuidados, porque son palabras excesivamente cargadas de demasiados significados. Entonces, si usamos, decimos, bueno, acá estamos hablando arte popular en este sentido. Yo no creo que exista un ente que se llame arte popular al cual le corresponda ese nombre. Es decir, en ese sentido no creo que exista casi ninguna sustancia que tenga un nombre fijo, ¿no?
Just to add a couple of thoughts here. I think there's definitely a friction between how this term is referred to historically and its relevance as a current theme today, as a current term today. Now, I think it would be, for me, it would be really strange to separate artists today between popular and not popular artists, or fine arts, or high arts. I think that would be extremely prejudicial, frankly. So in terms of the validity of the term, I would say that in the specific case of modern project in Brazil, I think it's a term that was, worth to bring back to give visibility to artists that had non-formal training, that didn't go to the art academies, that definitely claimed an art history or cultural history, or community history that went beyond the elitist values and circles. So I think in this term, I see the validity of the term. I think it's a term that has it can confer visibility to a number of artists working, and you can show something specific that separates them from the others in a way. Not that really pushes this art historical categories that are more conformed by the official critic and official critics and by the institutions and the academia. But I think also it's a term that should destroy itself in a way, because I think it's quite problematic to separate artists in a way that we categorize them as belonging or not belonging. So I think it's a term for me that has a historical validity, but we shouldn't. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to use it today.
We should be free to ditch it whenever
to cross it off.
To cross it out. Yeah. Whenever it becomes redundant.
Yeah.
But I think this is a really important point, also in addressing what has been a concern, I think, ongoing for us about sometimes institutions or universities or academics co-opting or appropriating certain languages or certain concepts that don't necessarily belong to them, and in that way distancing the actual enunciator from the use and currency of these works. So the institutions become instruments for imperialism, intellectual over knowledge, etc. But actually, on this note, I think it would be lovely to open to the audience and also open to us if you have questions for each other. But if anyone has any questions from the audience. I don't see. No? Okay, great. Well then, do you have any questions for each other? No?
Well, one question would be, if you use this term, are you always going to foreground biography? Is it always going to be followed by...
Oh, please use your
the mic.
Sorry, if you use this term popular or any of its relative cognates, is it always going to be followed by a question of biography? Like, how is this person who's referred to in these terms situated? Like, what are the markers? And does that then make biography the frame for reading the work?
I think if it's in the work, yes. No, but I don't think the case of the artists I was trying to talk about today, I don't think any of them claim to be artistas populares themselves, I think it's centering maybe biography, but also centering experience, worldviews, as an important way of, formulating their work or, putting their work forward. That again goes outside what other artists in more official circuits would be doing. But I think it's also, just to pick up something you said before, which is this friction with abstraction, right? With geometries, this is something that it came up yesterday. How it's being said historically that geometry is something that was invented by the European avant-garde, and that's obviously not the case. So I think this is an interesting also way of looking at the problem as a big geopolitical issue, between center and periphery, not necessarily as oscillations maybe as you claimed, but definitely being there, and structures of power. So I think, I kind of agree with something Miguel said, that in the 80s and 90s, there was a prevalence of a neoliberal model in Latin America at large, and a lot of cultural theory was again important, and formalism prevailed, or this idea that the artist should be connected to the art made internationally, that the artists had to insert him or themselves in the art circuit on a global discourse level. But I think it does come to, to different cultural experiences, frankly.
Bueno, yo pienso que quizá no sea útil usar el término arte popular para distinguir, en términos formales, distinguir estilos. Por ejemplo, lo popular ligado a lo naif, a lo primitivo, a una simplificación de la figura, etcétera, como es lo popular, más o menos naif. Ahora, a mí me parece fundamental desde el momento que, sobre todo, especialmente en América Latina, existen enormes mayorías sometidas a políticas de exterminio étnico, que esas mayorías se afirmen sus voces y sus diferencias y que puedan tener espacios donde ser escuchados, mantener un nombre de la diferencia, sea como fuera, no es lo mismo, no es que esté todo mezclado, que ya dé igual. La práctica que hace un artista de que tenga un origen indígena o un origen popular, urbano, sometido a condiciones extremas de miseria, que un artista que pertenezca a un sistema en el cual tiene facilitado su acceso a la institucionalidad, ¿verdad? Entonces, no se trata de marcar diferencias en términos ontológicos, de que exista un arte totalmente diferente sino de que existan sujetos que puedan mantener una nominación y una adscripción desde las cuales participar. Ojalá llegue un momento en que exista una igualdad tal de que se disuelvan las diferencias, pero las diferencias tienen que ser marcadas, porque si no estamos un poco hipócritamente pensando en una igualdad que no existe, lamentablemente. Ojalá pueda haber, y en ese sentido me parece importante esta Bienal, en la cual los artistas puedan ser invitados de tú a tú, de igual a igual, y una vez puestos en diálogo, uno se da cuenta que realmente hay como una unidad enorme en términos de intensidad de imagen expresiva de mundos, ¿verdad? Eso es indudable. Pero yo creo que la marca es importante, la marca de origen, no precisamente como, obviamente no para discriminar, sino para discutir la racialización, discutir la desigualdad, discutir a partir del carácter y la posición singular de grupos que siguen siendo oprimidos y excluidos. Y no puede negarse la existencia de esos grupos, ¿no? Esos grupos tienen que, inventemos otro nombre si se quiere, pero tiene que ser marcada esa diferencia para que pueda ser suprimida, para que pueda ser justamente pensar en situaciones de igualdad desde las cuales ese carácter popular pueda ser quizá un enriquecimiento de su arte, pero no a costa de la postergación, la explotación de las personas, ¿no?
Mil gracias, Ticio. Sí, bueno, I think this is a wonderful note. Kind of like yesterday, rather tragic facing the reality, but also empowering in the sense that we have something that we can do. But to end this conversation, we went way over time. But thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you to everyone for coming.